thank you all for coming. If you want to really bore somebody in life, a good thing to talk to them about is trade policy. And then if you want to really put them to sleep, you do trade policy and the IEPA and trade law. And so we thought this would be a good thing to hold a meeting on. So we've got three very highly qualified guests here. We have Dr. Inu Manak, who is a senior fellow for international trade at the Council on Foreign Relations. She got her Ph.D. in government from Georgetown. We also have, I failed to check this name in advance, Kate Kalutkiewicz.
Perfect.
I doubt it. Who's a senior managing director at McLarty Associates, where she leads the firm's trade practice and works on Europe and McLarty inbound. She previously served at, she previously worked as trade policy at Amazon and also served at the U.S. mission to the EU and at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And finally, we have Rory Heslington, from the Vice President for Government Affairs at Autos Drive America.
That's me.
And he previously served as International Trade Policy Advisor at the U.S. Senate Finance Committee under Senator Grassley, Chairman Grassley, and got his MBA from the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota and a bachelor's from Utah Valley University. So you're going to stay awake, and they're going to tell you everything you need to know about trade policy.
I don't know about that.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Olivia Kim, a research fellow at KaiPAC. Thank you for joining us for today's important discussion on Korea-U.S. trade dynamics. Today we are going to talk about how recent U.S. trade policies, including the Supreme Court's review of the IEPA tariff case, are shaping the broader trade landscape. Then we'll turn to industry impacts, particularly in autos, and discuss what the new Korea-U.S. trade deal and other regional developments mean for Korea's competitiveness going forward. And with that, let's begin the discussion with the legal landscape. And Inu, I'd like to start with you. So can you walk us through the key points from the Supreme Court's oral arguments on President Tariff's authority under IEPA? And based on your research and observation, in which direction does the court appear to be leaning?
Great. Well, thank you, Olivia, for this, and thank you to KaiPAC for having us here today. So this is a question everyone seems to be asking me the last week. Okay. So on Wednesday, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments regarding the use of IEPA for the president's tariffs that he put on both Canada, Mexico, and China, and then the rest of the world, the reciprocal tariffs as well. There are a few core arguments made by the government, focusing mainly on the fact that they argue that IEPA provides the president with broad authority to levy tariffs, and that the words within the statute itself essentially imply that tariffs are a tool that the president can use, even though the word tariff doesn't appear, or any word like tariff doesn't appear within the statute itself. So they also made another argument saying that essentially that the president has two sort of tariffing powers. There's like the regulatory power, and then there's the revenue power. And what the IEPA tariffs are about is the regulatory power. And he's saying this because essentially, if you look at the statute, it says that it gives the president the ability to regulate the importation or exportation, and without the use of the word tariff and raising revenue, which is the express purview of Congress, you're basically saying that, you know, the president's just regulating trade here. He's not doing anything else. He's not doing this for raising revenue at all. Revenue is incidental to everything that's going on. So that was the government's main claim. Interestingly, if you actually read their brief, within the first page, they have a tweet from the president that essentially says, this is going to make us a lot of money, and it's raising trillions of dollars in revenue. So a lot of their arguments were sort of undercut by their own evidence that they submitted, and that became a very contentious part of the back and forth discussion with the justices. The plaintiffs, on the other hand, were claiming that, this is something that's never been used before to levy tariffs. The word tariff doesn't appear anywhere in the statute, and so you're basically reading into the statute that tariffs are possible. And they also said that this is basically a huge extension of the non-delegation of the Congress. So the Congress would not have delegated this much authority to the president, and therefore this doesn't really make any sense. So what's going to happen? I don't know. I don't think anyone really knows. We're all reading the tea leaves and trying to think about what the justices were asking and how they seem to sit on different issues. If you listen to the arguments, they went on for about 3 hours. Mostly, it seemed like the liberal justices seemed quite skeptical of government's arguments. Of the conservative justices, Justice Gorsuch and Justice Roberts seem to also be questioning some of the underlying arguments of the government. On the others, it's not so clear, but even that, those are still fence sitters as well. So if I had to look at just the arguments on their face, I would say that the government's case is not that strong, and for those reasons, I think that those tariffs will probably be overturned.
I think that was a good overview of what was addressed and how we should kind of go about here. So let's say if the Trump administration loses the IEEPA case, what other legal or policy options or tools does it have to continue its tariff policies? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of those alternatives?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different tools that the administration could use. Nothing that's an exact replacement for what they've done. So I think that if you were to look at some of the statutes that they could basically call on, one that got mentioned by several amicus briefs that were submitted was Section 122. And Section 122 allows the president to raise tariffs for balance of payments crises, and that's up to 15%. So, and that's also for a limited amount of time, 150 days. Yeah. So it wouldn't be an unending sort of use of this. It would have to be ratified by Congress if you wanted to extend it. So there's all this the guardrail involved in all of that. In addition to that, they could use Section 338, which would be to target some sort of discrimination that they find with regard to some practices from certain countries. That would be much more country-specific. I can imagine how they could potentially broaden it. The statute says there is supposed to be some sort of investigation, but it's not really clear if that's necessary from the ITC. So there are some potential guardrails, but I could imagine that they would, overlook some of those and impose tariffs that way. But they may also just use the tools they've already been using, right? So Section 232. We've seen a really expansive use of 232 under this administration. I would imagine that would include several other things at some point. And that's just product specific though, so that's not going to be like sort of the broad tariffs that they envision. They could engage in some more Section 301 investigations on unfair trade practices, but again, that would have to be sort of country specific, and so they'd have to tailor it that way. I would imagine that's something they could potentially do, but at the end of the day, I think this sort of broad tariffs would be difficult to do. I will throw out there the one potential thing that could happen is that we could see the Supreme Court tossing out the reciprocal tariffs, but then keeping the fentanyl tariffs, and partly because there could be a rationale for imposing those because there is a national security justification for that. So that's potentially where we might see that, but I would imagine the administration's already thinking about what they're going to do and are probably ready to go if those tariffs do come off.
I think the fentanyl tariff, the part is really interesting because that contains not just China but also Mexico and Canada, which are U.S.'s close allies and partners, right? And USMCA. So that's gonna be really interesting to see how that plays out in USMCA, which is another different discussion. So
yes,
so
coming up in July.
yeah. So. Thank you, for laying out the legal foundation so clearly. And Kate, let me turn to you to expand on the implications of a potential ruling. So, if the Supreme Court again rules against the U.S. in the IEEPA case, what would happen to the tariffs already collected under IEEPA? That's a lot of money right there. So, is there a process or precedent for mass refunds, and how likely is that to be implemented?
It's a harder question probably to predict than the Supreme Court outcome.
Though,
No, it's the most important question, frankly. I think there is precedent. I mean, it's not exactly, but I think we have seen these sorts of rebates before. I think during the Clinton administration under something called the harbor maintenance tax. And so I think there is a way to issue rebates from Treasury. I am certainly no Treasury or tax expert, but I think some of it is tied to a tax year, and I think there is going to be the need to move quickly, and we'll have to see if it requires legislation. I assume Congress is thinking about what it would need to do. So I think practically speaking, there is a precedent. I think practically speaking, there is a way to issue refunds. Then there is an entire political dynamic that we don't know yet how that will go. Clearly, the president will not want to do wide-scale refunds. I mean, he does talk quite a lot about the revenue that tariffs have generated, even the day of the Supreme Court decision. Not only the tweet in the brief, but even the day and the next day in an Oval Room briefing talked about the revenue generation. He's talked already, of course, about some very populist measures to award refunds. He's clearly doing that not because he's preparing it. I mean, he may well be thinking about it, but he's certainly making the political case to American voters right now that the Supreme Court wants to take your money from you. Will that work? I don't know. But this is clearly, I think, the dilemma that he is going to lay out for companies that may try to seek rebates and then be dragged through the mud by the president. So this is going to create a very, very difficult environment, I think. We've also seen the market start to be created for third-party firms who are willing to buy tariffs, right, at a lower value, but it does not negate the role of the company in actually seeking the refund. So they're going to be implicated no matter what. So I think we will see. For me, the bigger question is what happens to all the trade deals, and I can't remember if we're going to get to that, but certainly the IEEPA, the thing about IEEPA, unlike these other trade authorities that Congress has also granted to the administration. I mean, obviously, we all know the Constitution gives the power to regulate tariffs and trade to Congress. This is what's at stake here. But they have given tons of authority to the executive branch. The president likes IEEPA because it does not require the types of processes that these other things require. But the irony, and perhaps for all the businesses that are cheerleading the Supreme Court, the irony is that IEEPA is actually pretty great for them too, because it can be taken off very quickly. We see the president put the tariffs on and then remove them as a tool of leverage. These other tariffs, once they are in place, they are extremely durable. We have seen 232 used in such an expansive way with, frankly, concentric circles going beyond the initial outcome to include derivatives, and where we see steel tariffs now impacting washing machines and everything, power generators and the rest. That the outcome here may be a much more dramatically high tariff environment, and one that is rigid and sticks with us for some time. So I think that's an outcome that we do need to prepare ourselves for, even if IEEPA is struck down.
I see. So now I want to move to the broader strategic landscape. So South Korea and the US recently finalized the details of a trade deal.
Have they? They
haven't
published it yet.
You'll not be there, but I mean, they announced, right?
Yes.
So they did something, right? And the US also reached a trade deal with Japan in July, and most recently established trade truce with China. A lot happening here.
Yeah.
So, in your view, how do these recent developments reflect Washington's broader strategy in Asia? And what implication might they have for South Korea's trade competitiveness and strategic positioning going forward? So it's a lot of things to
I think the outcome of the Asia trip was terrific. I mean, I think that by all accounts, this was a success for President Trump and his trade agenda. I mean, I think if you first kind of take a step back and look at the China lens, and I do think we are in a situation in this administration which is different from the first. In the first administration, we had a very clear plan to address certain issues in China. We clearly are lacking that sort of strategic vision. And so we tend to just cycle around the status quo. We escalate to de-escalate, and we end up largely in the same place. I think that's due in part to the fact that this go around, neither side seems to be able to get the leverage over the other. I keep comparing it to a thumb wrestle because like they just keep trying to get over the other, but we keep playing with the same toolbox. You know, we put tariffs on and China restricts, they strangle us around the rare earths, and this is the situation that's working. What I think was important in the Asia trip, of course, was the president's other part of this strategy, which is, you know, frankly, to isolate China, to cut off the connections between China and other trading partners. So that's part one. So the trade deals you saw with Cambodia and Malaysia were quite significant because of some of the language around, they didn't say China, I don't think, but of course it was relevant to China. The agreements before the Asia trip with Australia around securing new critical minerals investments. That was obviously a component of Japan as well. Japan and Korea, obviously quite important for their commitments on investments in critical sectors in the United States. I think the president and his team understand, and if you look at a list of 232 investigations and look at what Korea does exceptionally well, you see a lot of overlap. So I think there is a great deal of interest in working with Korean leaders. I mean, I think Korea's superpower are its businesses and what they can do to support the industrial goals of the United States, and I think that's been helpful. I will say, I mean, I think Korea benefited from being the end of that trip, and the president was really in a mindset to be doing deals, and I think that's why we don't have a deal out yet, really. I think the president said, I want it, I'm gonna say it's done, but I don't think it's done. So I think it's obviously important that they continue to work on that. I think Korea and Japan, and everyone else, frankly, that has had less detailed trade agreements, let's say, probably should be looking at the language in the Cambodia and Malaysia agreements and thinking about whether they can commit to that, because I think that will be the new template for the United States as it approaches trade agreements going forward.
I think that Cambodia and Malaysia, the parts are like really interesting, and before coming in, we talk a little bit about Malaysia, and I think that maybe we can talk about that in the question that comes up, So that was incredibly helpful to understand like what happened in APEC, overall like strategy in the Asia region. So turning to industry impact, Rory, the auto sector has been the most affected like sector, I feel like, in this year, right? So
I certainly feel that way.
Yeah. When the 25% auto tariff was first announced in May, there was a panic across the auto industry. But since then, we've seen companies adjust quickly. Cost forecasts have dropped, regulatory penalties have eased, and the US production has increased. From your perspective, how has the auto industry absorbed the impact of this year's tariff wave? And what have been the most significant strategic or operational adjustments?
It's a big question. First, I think what's really happened in the auto industry is that they've actually just absorbed the tariffs, right? Between April and June of this year, the auto industry as a whole has paid over $12 billion in tariffs. So you take another 3 months of that, we're probably around $20 billion and just from the auto industry paid. Those costs have largely not been passed along to the consumer. Many of the automakers are absorbing the tariffs for their suppliers as well, because the suppliers don't have the capital to do so.
Right.
We've already seen this year, I think 6 near misses on plant shutdowns because of disputes between suppliers and automakers. And so I think what's happening right now is most automakers are trying, and this includes Detroit and my members, which are the Korean, Japanese, and German automakers, are absorbing tariffs, trying to maintain their market share, and kind of waiting for the landscape to settle so they can start making strategic decisions. I think we're starting to get to that point where things are beginning to settle, and that then automakers and their supply chains will have to make some tough decisions on what they do. But largely, so far, it's been pay the tariffs, absorb the costs, and try to weather the storm is kind of what's been happening.
So I think that's exactly right, like the weather the storm, right? You just have to adapt and just live with it, right, for now. So I want to kind of zoom into Korea. So companies like Hyundai and Kia have not only weathered the tariff environment, but seem to be doubling down on the US market. Hyundai even described the US as its most profitable region. How are Korean automakers navigating the current tariff environment? And what does the new South Korea-US trade deal and tariff relief mean for their long-term investment and production strategies in the US in terms of the auto sector?
I don't think we know yet, because I mean, as we kind of just discussed, the deal is done, it's not done, and as I always tell my members, don't get too excited until you see something from the White House. I think if the deal gets implemented as it was described with the 15% rate across the board, which would include autos, I think that puts Korea back on a level playing field with Japan and the European Union. And what that means for their investment, I don't know. I think Hyundai and Kia have made major inroads into the U.S. market over the last 5-6 years. They've really turned their reputation around as far as quality, what kind of cars. I think everyone knows Hyundai just opened their $7 billion plant in Savannah, Georgia. They're making EVs here. They're making gasoline vehicles here, and they're highly integrated in the North American market as well. So I think they're going to keep moving forward with all that, and with a lower rate, even if it is 7 times higher than it was before, it frees up capital for them to continue investing here. And I think why we're seeing nobody raise their prices or pull back is because no one wants to lose their market share for now. Now, if the economic situation changes and we see a dip in demand for vehicles, or production costs get too high where you just can't produce competitively, then I think automakers will have to make different decisions, but it's too early. I mean, the auto industry is on it's very capital intensive, and they operate in 5 to 10 year product cycles where those investments kind of need to play out before you start making new decisions.
So it's really interesting because depending on the sector, like the price shows, like but then Kate mentioned, is sticky, right? Sometimes you have to wait and see, and that impact may just last even the tariff policy or some regulation die. So it's gonna be really interesting to see how things play out. So now I want to open up broader questions for all of you. And are higher tariffs and trade realignment we are seeing in this year simply creating higher costs and more complexity for producers and consumers? Or are they actually driving genuine supply resilience, such as diversification or inventory management?
I think from the auto side, it's certainly creating more costs for the automakers and their suppliers. It's certainly creating more complexity.
Yeah.
Is it forcing some automakers to rethink their supply chains? Absolutely. I think we saw that in Trump's first term, where you saw a lot of diversification away from China and moved a lot of their supply chains to Mexico, and I think that might be the case this time, but I think it's not going to be in Mexico. Automakers are going to have to make decisions on whether or not it makes economic and sense to move things here, or near shore or something else. It's really going to depend on economies of scale and what their capital availability is like.
Yeah, I mean, just broadly speaking, we totally agree that this kind of goes back to really the first Trump administration, was continued throughout the Biden administration, and now here we are. And I would say that for a company with large global supply chains, the need to know details about the various parts of your supply chain it's just going to continue to be important. And I think this started really broadly during the first Trump administration, as this notion that we had outsourced too much. And then of course the tariffs, absolutely, we saw massive move away from China, not to the US, maybe not even to Mexico. We saw quite a lot of movement to Vietnam and Southeast Asia, and for whatever it's worth. The Biden administration, likewise, and Congress. If we even look at the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or we look at the rules that were related to the IRA on foreign entities of concern, right? Like, it wasn't just about the widget, it was about the ownership structure of the parent company that supplied the widget, and a very complicated mathematical formula from Treasury about how to figure out if there was too much CCP involvement, right? And so these sorts of discussions they're very important and they're growing, right? And President Trump at this point has really focused in on a question, which is, if you have access to our market from a preferential standpoint, USMCA, this will be the discussion about USMCA. If you are considered a product of Mexico, how much foreign content should you be allowed to have and still be considered a product of Mexico and have this great access to the United States? So, I mean, this is the boring part of trade policy, right? The substantial transformation discussion around how you move from a bunch of Chinese pieces into a product of Mexico, right? But this is trade law, and it will require a massive change in policy and implementation and compliance costs to figure out how to address this issue. But this has been a subject that we've been talking about for more than the Trump presidency. I mean, around this question, and you see it in the agreements. This is the language. We can get back to this language in Malaysia and Cambodia and some of this obscure reference to transshipment, which is about Chinese goods. So I think that companies are really going to have to know, right, where everything is coming from, where it's sourced from. And I think this is driving decisions to change supply lines. It certainly means that we've seen a lot more China for China. So people maintaining two different supply lines. I think the auto sector is interesting because they've always sort of done this. They've really made and produced in the market that they're selling in. So you were really the first movers in this, but I think increasingly we're seeing other sectors having to do that.
Yeah, we're really concerned about the potential changes around substantial transformation rules and what that might mean for the auto industry. And then there's this delicate balance between cost versus affordability, and cars are more expensive than they've ever been in the United States. I think the last month's data showed the average transaction price for a new vehicle in the United States was $51,000. We're now seeing 8 to 10 year loans on vehicles, just showing that people cannot afford vehicles anymore. And a lot of that is because the vehicles they're choosing high trims with lots of the technology, so that makes makes them more expensive, which is also where the profit margins are for the automakers. So they're going to make more of those because that's what people want, that's where the profits are. But there's going to be a breaking point in that, and just yesterday there was an article about we are seeing the highest delinquency rates in auto loans since 2009, which is also a worrying development and just kind of the economic data. So.
Yeah, maybe I'll add to this and say, I think a lot of time we focus on the multinational companies and these big supply chains and their ability to weather this. That's one part of the story. But what we're starting to see is pass through of the tariffs through mid and small businesses. And they are not capable of actually eating those tariffs. And so we are starting to see throughout the market the impacts of the tariff policy on these businesses, and for them it's not going very well. And so I think what we're starting to see are two different sort of markets emerge in that sense. It's like the ones that can deal with the tariffs and those that can't. And I think that what we are starting to also witness is the fact that there was a delay in sort of all that pass-through happening because there was a lot of tariff uncertainty. And now that there is certainty, I'm seeing some numbers say we're getting like 70% pass-through. That will probably grow as more of these tariff lines settle and everyone decides what they're going to pay. The other thing is the administration has just made a mess of how they rolled this out, right? So it's just been constant changes are actually not good for businesses trying to navigate this. But then also with the removal of de minimis, the de minimis package processing is a complete and utter mess, and it's mostly small businesses that are being affected by that. I have a chat group with my friends where we basically post like our receipts, our customs receipts, to see whether we get charged tariffs as being our own importers, and we've been importing from different places just to see what happens. A lot of stuff is not being captured by CBP. And it's really interesting to see which things they're focusing on, which ones they're not, and it just shows that there is not a lot of consistent application of any of these policies either. So for those who are doing these imports, it's hard to know what to expect, because there's no guarantee that because the law says there's no more de minimis, that you're actually going to pay a tariff.
I see.
And so that is creating even more uncertainty for the small businesses, so they can't plan at all. And then you're just getting hit by tariff bills randomly when you get that in your mail. So this is actually a very difficult thing, I think, for them to navigate. So while big players may be okay, I think we have to be very concerned about the overall ripple effects on the rest of the economy.
That was really interesting. So Next question. So, given the aggressive use of tariff under the Trump administration, is this a sustainable strategy for maintaining trade leverage, or is it undermining long-term partnership cohesion, like with country like South Korea?
I think it is a sustainable strategy, and I say that because I mean, I was a trade negotiator for 15 years. We have always negotiated with the power of our market. The US market is attractive, right? It's attractive because you have 300 million consumers that all speak the same language, that operate in a regulatory environment that is very open and transparent and fairly low as a regulatory environment when compared with other large markets. In the past, of course, we negotiated FTAs, again, on the basis of our market. We gave you better access, but we asked you to change your laws, right? There was always a notional leverage balance there, which, we did by lowering tariffs, and this is really the flip side of it. And I think we are finding that people want to do business here, right? And also, I think it's a disservice, potentially, not to give credit to the president's economic agenda for also incentivizing moves. It's not just the tariffs that he's put in place that continue to draw certain types of investments to the U.S. It's certainly, tax policy, a deregulation agenda. You can't really discount some of those too. Those are big drivers when you look at the big investment dollars. It's not just the tariffs, but the tariffs help. I think what's interesting to me, just linking back to IEEPA, without IEEPA, it's going to be harder for him to make threats. There are going to be different types of threats, right? And I think ironically, you were talking about Mexico and Canada. Ironically enough, I mean, IEEPA has created a situation where actually Mexico and Canada are the best positioned because they got a huge exemption for USMCA. If IEEPA goes away and he loses that leverage, he's going to go back to some of his regular playing cards, which is USMCA. I mean, what else is he going to do? He's going to threaten to rip up USMCA. And that's going to be worrying to most companies and certainly our partners in North America. And so I think that will be a very negative situation if that's the outcome there. And I think it'll be negative for Mexico and Canada as well. I guess we'll have to see on that.
It would certainly be bad for the auto industry.
It certainly would be. It'd be bad for the U.S. economy.
Any other thoughts?
No, I think he has plenty of leverage outside of IEEPA, so I would disagree with that. I think that he's going to threaten to withdraw from USMCA regardless of what happens at the Supreme Court, because it's an abundant amount of leverage with Canada and Mexico no matter what. I don't think he needs to do much in terms of actually threatening them. And the fact is the statute does not provide for the president to negotiate trade agreements and any of this. So, I mean, it becomes a big question about whether or not this is the tool that should be used and whether that's the tool that Congress intended the president to use for any of these things. And so think about what happens in another administration, which wants to use this tool as leverage for any number of things, maybe unrelated to trade. Would we be okay with that and then say, yes, it's a great point of leverage if it's a policy we all disagree with? So it's like, it's fine to cheer President Trump because he's doing the things that you care about, but the second it's another administration doing something you don't like, well then nobody better complain about it. So I think that the big challenge we're facing right now is the fact that the president is using a tool where it's not clear that tariffs are okay under that tool and whether negotiations are part of that package. I think most of our trading partners would negotiate with us if we actually, in good faith, were negotiating with them. I think that they've been wanting to address a lot of issues for a long time. The question is that we really haven't been clear about what it is that we want to a large extent. So I think really spelling that out is helpful. I think we're seeing some of that now, which is helpful to spell out like what our desires are, what our needs are, and having a conversation on that basis is helpful. But I think that generally speaking, most of them are willing to talk. It's just that what we're seeing in all these agreements is not really an actual trade agreement that we're familiar with. These are really asymmetrical. This is U.S. making demands. I understand in the past, yes, the United States uses market leverage all the time. Not like this. This is different. This is pure economic coercion in a very different fashion. So we're not saying maybe you can work with us to change your laws. We're saying you must change your laws.
No, I mean, I actually disagree. I mean, without some of the leverage, you don't get to an agreement. I mean, I say that from experience with the European Union. I mean, absent any sort of tariff leverage, we were never going to get to any sort of arrangement with them. We probably wouldn't have renegotiated the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement without the leverage that he brings. And whether it's right or not, and I think to your point is an important one, right? Whether it's right or not is a good question. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, it is up to Congress, which has really abdicated its responsibility here, to restrain the president, to take away these authorities. But then we get into the flip side of it. It's the flip side of it, right? Which is, I don't want to take it away for their guy because I might want it for my guy. I mean, so it is this issue, I think, which is important to remember. The president, frankly, uses the authorities until they're taken away. That's true of a Democrat, too. I mean, it's not unique to President Trump. The first real massive use of executive authority, maybe not on trade, but it was under the Obama administration, and it was certainly because Congress was not acting. They were not delivering results on certain things that administration cared about, and so we saw the increase in a use of executive authority. It's simply grown since then, of course, while Congress, again, abdicates its responsibilities. So, you know, in many ways, you're right, some of the trade deals are very different from what we've ever seen. But these newer ones, I mean, Cambodia and Malaysia, again, are a return to what we used to see. They're very consistent with the things that Congress put forward in Trade Promotion Authority. We're seeing language there, again, which is legally relevant. There may not be dispute settlement, and there may not be a passage of Congress, but they are still commitments ostensibly in line with the policy objectives we have had from national trade estimates, from Congress, from U.S. business interests. And so if it takes a little bit of leverage to get those across the finish line, that might be in the U.S. economic interest.
I don't know that I have much more to add. Admittedly, I've been less focused on the IEEPA tariffs than I have on the sectoral tariffs because, I mean, while IEEPA does mildly affect the auto industry, we're much more concerned about the 232s and steel and aluminum, autos, you know, potential for critical minerals and batteries and everything else that's coming. And I think that also holds a lot of leverage over the countries that we've been dealing with because those are major economic sectors for every one of these countries, right? And I don't know what it means for the long term for the relationship. I think businesses are going to continue wanting to do business here. And we do still have the biggest market in the world, the best place to do business still, despite all the uncertainty that's been introduced. But we have seen some cooling of those relationships. I mean, Canada's the perfect example, right? I mean, they have started to say, well, we might start looking elsewhere. Which can they execute on that? I don't know. But just the fact that they've started talking like that is a little worrying to me. But I think we're only 11 months into this administration, so let's see what happens.
So, let me sidetrack a little bit here because Malaysia and Cambodia kept coming up. So, could you, one of you or all of you, explain what the deals were about and you mentioned the rhetoric and the words. Could you guys elaborate a little bit?
Sure. I mean, if we go back to the America First trade policy agenda, I mean, we lost our way really from when the president first announced what he was going to do, which was all about reciprocity and fairness and pushing back against trade barriers. And he held up the National Trade Estimate Report, which is this hundreds-page document of complaints of U.S. companies about market barriers. And, he directed USTR to go out and confront those and deal with those. And ostensibly, the tariffs were about creating leverage to do that. So this really is the first, I think, step in that direction. All these other agreements have been sectoral focused. They've been commitments on investments. Let's buy some soybeans or gas or whatever. Cambodia and Malaysia are, they have chapters in them that mimic what an FTA would have. They have chapters on, agriculture regulation and manufacturing regulation and geographic indications, which really is a signal that we're going back to what Congress has asked for. Commitments on digital policy. They are very broad and comprehensive. Most of these things can be done in an executive agreement. They do not require congressional consent because they don't change U.S. law. What does require change is tariffs. And so if he loses IEEPA, this is a question about the validity of those tariffs. But there were new provisions in these agreements, and this is something that I've at least spoken to USTR about being the new template. This is, trade negotiators are not creative. You just kind of take the last thing and put it on the table for the next guy. And there is language on coordinating on essentially any trade deals with China, right? Trying to ensure that our trading partners, if they want a preferential market access to the United States, they have to commit to not allowing Chinese companies to have access to their markets in ways that undermine the United States companies, right? So this can be interpreted in a couple different ways. I think we'll have to see it in action. But if they are sectors for which the US has alleged that the Chinese are engaging in unfair practices like dumping or unfair subsidization, it looks like the agreement would enable them to say to the counterpart, you have to block those, or you have to put tariffs, or you have to do something to make this fair again. So this is new. For me, the big question is how China is going to respond to this.
Right.
It's in its own neighborhood, it's their partners too. But it's pretty significant that those countries agreed to that language, and I guess we'll just have to see it in practice.
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're looking at the agreements themselves. It's not really clear how it's going to be enforced yet. So that's a big question. You can put, words on a paper. It doesn't mean anything unless you actually enforce it. So the question is, what are countries going to do in terms of actually adopting some of those new high standards that are in there? And I agree with you, yes, there are a lot of things that Congress has asked for in the past. There's no more TPA, so they haven't asked for it recently. So that would have to sort of come through Congress if they wanted to actually have Congress weigh in on this and make these more durable. Because at the moment, there's provisions in there that say that these could lapse, that parties can withdraw, and within 180 days, they disappear. So in many ways, these are purely executive agreements at this point. They don't have a force of law in U.S. law. As international agreements, they're binding, but not as a matter of U.S. law at all. And so there's a question about, what you do if you're a U.S. company that has a concern about some of these things too, right? So I think that there are bigger questions about enforcement that have not yet been answered. The second thing is, we're asking these countries to do a lot, but nowhere in there is there any provision about capacity building. So how are they going to do it? I don't quite know yet. And there's a lot of things in there that I think are, long wish list of USTR for a long time, really specific like SPS and TBT issues. Again, not really clear how these countries will enforce or adopt those new rules. But again, it's just sort of like putting all the things you've always wanted for a long time in a big list and hoping that they deliver them. So I still don't know whether it's going to work. Let's wait and see. But I think it really is USTR putting a lot of weight on trying to get through things in the National Trade Estimates Report and otherwise that have been big irritants for a long time.
I think that it's really interesting. Ever since Trump administration came in, we start focusing on not just our own, but looking at other countries' trade deals as well, and those really are impactful sometimes. And sometimes you just need to know how to navigate this uncertain time. So last question now. So, looking ahead, what policy, legal, or geopolitical developments, whether from Washington, Seoul, or elsewhere, do you believe will most significantly shape South Korea-US trade relations over next 1 to 3 years?
You want to go first?
I think it's China. It's probably the U.S.-China discussion. Where are we going to end up? I think this has probably got to be a huge question for every major trading partner. Are we going to get sold out by the United States?
Yeah.
We're making all these commitments, we're taking their side, but then is he going to do a grand bargain with China that is not great for us? That's what I would. That is what I would be considering, right? And so it's I don't know, when I talk to companies, when I talk to governments, I think it's always so important to make decisions that are in your best interest, not to appease Donald Trump. I think that's the best advice I can give. Canada, they may well want to push back, but what is in their best interest is staying economically linked with the United States and weathering this storm. Because, again, there are 300 million Americans that are not Donald Trump, and we'll get through this. And what is important for Canada is to figure out how to stay connected with the United States. Now, I'm not a domestic politician in Canada, so that must be very difficult. For a company, do you want to align yourself with the U.S. market, which is long-standing and consistent, or do some short-term promise with China? I mean, maybe it's better, and you should do that. But you should be thinking about it in those ways, as opposed to how can I make Donald Trump happy today, or in the next year or the year after. I think most times countries are still going to align with the United States. I think we have seen this. I've been very interested in the emerging role of the Europeans and the G7 on the rare earths issues. I mean, no longer can the Europeans say we're not going to pick sides, right? I mean, I think they're going to have to. Again, they'll need to do what's in their best interest and not try to do a short-term solution here. But I would say that's true for Korea as well. I mean, Korea is going to have to think about where is its long-term vision for security and economic stability and all the rest of it. I don't envy the position, right? It's a very challenging position to be in. But that would be the lens I would try to look through all of this with.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that I think most people are thinking about this in terms of, how do you get through all of this in the next, 3 years? I can't believe we're only 11 months in, but 3 more years left of this. How do you get to the other side? What's going to happen next? It's hard to know what's going to happen next, right? Biden continued a lot of Trump's first-term tariff policies, so I would imagine a lot of the tariffs we see today are going to stick around. And regardless of which ones they are, I think they have a lot of staying power. So I think there's a long-term strategy there. The challenge for a lot of U.S. trading partners is the fact that they have audience cost too. I think in Washington we tend to assume that our audience is the only one that matters. That's not true. There's other calculations that countries have to make, and they have to answer their own constituencies. So the concern is if they seem to be caving, that looks bad for them and they could get voted out of office. And so there are other considerations they have to take. And so I think whether it's a sound strategy to just go all in to tying yourself to the US market like Canada, I think Canada's in a really difficult position. I think for the Carney government, they have to consider how much they want to do that openly, because they're facing headwinds politically at home where they have a party in opposition that is really trying to dismantle the Carney government's initiatives. And so what do, right? So would you risk destabilization domestically just to keep the North American market as is right now, or can you do that quietly and try to have other overtures of rhetoric that kind of go against Trump? It does not help that Trump is so vocal. And I think this is something that his advisors have to get better at, is making sure he's not out there saying certain things, because it makes it harder for our foreign counterparts to negotiate with us. And having some understanding that other countries have constituents too would be very helpful to making U.S. policy a lot more successful, I think, in the long term.
I think for the auto sector specifically, it's going to be the USMCA and its linkage to China, and what the rules in the USMCA to China mean for the auto industry. Whether real or not, there's a perception in this administration that China is the back door, or Mexico is the back door for Chinese content, right? Korean automakers, Japanese automakers, even the American automakers are all heavily invested in the North American automotive supply chain. And how the USMCA develops is probably going to be very impactful to the sector and to other sectors. I mean, all manufacturing. So I think that's something to watch really closely, and then especially how companies can invest in the region or not.
So we've covered a lot of grounds today. So let me open up the questions for the floor. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and when you speak, please state your name and your affiliation. Sure.
Yes, my name is Prab. I actually had a quick question on how if U.S. could boost the way the Korea relationship is. Korea could let more boots on the ground, U.S. boots on the ground in Korea, and also maybe giving more solidarity to U.S. in the Korean land. Do you think that will help intrigue Trump? I mean, I think there are about 25,000 U.S. soldiers right now in Korea. Having more, could that make Trump happy? Somehow get their relations better.
I'm just a trade person, but no, I don't think he wants more military deployed. I mean, I think he'd like sharing of security. I mean, I think for him, it's probably less of a military presence, but more of a shared sort of cost and also responsibility. I mean, we see that play out in Europe, so I would imagine that's similar in Korea and Japan. From a military strategic standpoint, when you started your question, I was thinking about like access of U.S. companies in Korea. There are some very significant concerns that U.S. companies have raised about the way they can access the Korean market. And we've seen Korean companies have done exceptionally well in the United States. I think probably a lot of Americans have no idea that some of these companies are Korean, which is a testament to the brand and the marketability and, again, the access in our market. We're wide open for foreign investment. So I think in the past decade, there have been moments where Korean investment in the U.S. surpasses every other market. We don't see that in the U.S. I think it's been declining, and largely that's been because of regulatory barriers. We see increasing barriers in the digital space. Now, the question for me is whether the president actually cares about any of those things or whether he just wants high-value purchase agreements. So I think there could be some potential for movement in the U.S.-Korea trade environment that could stabilize things a little bit, but some of it would have to be in Korea around some of the barriers that U.S. companies face.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Tom Ramage with KEI. I have a question about Section 232s. So I think the numbers are that 57% of Korea's tariff burden is actually on autos. Autos, and then semiconductors are the other big 232 category that we're waiting for. Let's say the Supreme Court strikes down IEEPA tariffs. Well, it seems like the great majority of Korea's trade volume would be in these Section 232 categories. What room for negotiation do you think there is on negotiating on 232 itself? And then is there any potential for exemptions with something like that, or quotas?
I think they've done the negotiating on the 232s that they're going to get. Autos was a huge sticking point for all, well, at least for Europe, Japan, and Korea. And what I have learned in my advocacy efforts around the 232s is you don't use the E word, you don't use exemptions, you don't use exceptions. You come at it in different ways, and that's how we've gotten some of this relief. You know, you have the U.S. production offset credits. We've gotten exemptions for USMCA qualifying parts. Korea, Japan, and Europe have gotten 15% on autos rather than 25. I don't think there's going to be any more room there, and I think Korea, speaking just what I've seen, and every other country is going to want to keep the rates they've negotiated so far. Sticking points on steel and aluminum is still something that I know all countries are interested in. I don't know what others have views.
I think we are moving toward more flexibility, not less. I mean, I think that some of the policies have been rolled out in such a dramatically unplanned way that they're starting to hurt each other. Like they're hurting the president's goals, right? And so in some cases in 232, I think if you take 232 at its statutory aim, which is to recreate manufacturing capabilities for some of these sectors because we've determined it's in our national security interest. The reality is, and particularly relevant to Korea, they have the know-how. They know how to make, advanced steel. They know how to make good cars. They know how to make ships. We haven't had a 232 on ship, but I think we might. They know how to make semiconductors, right? So I think there is a pathway. We've seen it start to emerge on pharmaceuticals, right? Not formally, but certainly this notion, this wink, this handshake, if you make significant investments, well, maybe there are tariff exemptions on the table for you. I agree, we don't use the E word. Credits, flexibilities. So I think we are trending in that direction. Maybe not wholesale. I don't know on steel and aluminum because that one's maybe shut. Capital equipment. There are lots of things that if you're going to make a big investment in the United States, you need to have here.
I think you're right. Maybe there are flexibilities for things that we would like to have an industry for. Autos is my world, so autos is the exception because it is the vast majority of most major economies trade deficit with the U.S. And if you take the president at his word, that's what he cares about, is the trade deficit. He wants to see more equitable, even trade in those areas. And so I think, especially on autos, I think we're at where we're going to be for a while.
And autos, it just feels, it's just such a personal, emotional industry that they want here.
Yeah.
They want a strong Detroit. They want auto manufacturing.
And it's worth noting, GM is one of the largest automotive exporters from Korea. So I think they export 400,000 vehicles a year from Korea to the U.S.
Interesting.
So it's not just one way. I mean, American companies have gone there, which may be part of this focus.
Sure.
Hi, Neil Salzberg, also with Korea Economic Institute. I want to go back to kind of where we started off the conversation about IEPA. You mentioned the argument about sort of revenue raising, and it followed a discussion about other measures that are included in IEPA, such as licensing, quotas. Is that, depending on sort of the objectives of the administration, which I'll also let you sort of touch on, is there a feasible scenario where IEPA might be used again for sort of wide sweeping measures, but not using tariffs, but either sort of a some sort of design with licenses, raising more or less revenue, or quotas, or something else that's similar? Thank you.
I think they certainly could. Like to see the design of that executive order to see what's going to happen with that. But I think that they can certainly be creative about how they use it, just like they've been with just about every other statute that they've employed so far. So I think, we have to wait and see. But I would imagine, yes, they'll probably look at that again. You just can't put broad tariffs on place, most likely. I think it's what the core rule.
I'll just say, from a sectoral angle, business would hate that. I think business would much rather have a tariff than a quota or an embargo. If you have a quota, then that just means you have no supply left. So I think that would be a tough angle from the business perspective for them to manage. I think that would cause major concern in the business sector.
I think they're definitely on the table. So again, be careful what you wish for with
Yeah,
this.
cool. Yeah. Thanks.
So if we don't have any more questions, I'm gonna wrap up today's discussion, and I want to sincerely thank our panelists, making time here and sharing their insights, and we really hope that our conversation kind of gave you a better understanding of what's going on with the Korea-US trade deals, and not just that, regional developments and how the US trade policy is kind of going forward. So. Thank you so much for joining today's conversation, not just our panelists, but everyone here. And we wish and we hope to see you again at our future events. So thank you.